The first time I wrote under the Emperor's dictation in St. Helena, I asked him to repeat himself. Continue, he replied. After that, I carefully avoided doing so. There were always a dozen well-sharpened pencils on the Emperor's desk, and I used them, thus saving all the time I would have taken to dip my pen in the inkwell had I used one. He dictated with such clarity and flow that one could see no other thought entered his mind to disturb the work he was doing. The Emperor had an astonishing memory. He used to say on this subject that he knew better than the war or naval officers what the personnel and equipment of the regiments or squadrons were. When he went back to bed at night after a few hours' dictation, he would tell me to go and put his notes in order for his awakening. If it should happen this was not done, he would approach me, say I was lazy, and put his hand on my ear. This was a sign of approval, of which everyone was jealous. For him, it was a sign of satisfaction with the man who was thus touched, and helped to relieve the monotony of our existence. I've already said, and I repeat it again, the Emperor was kind, mirthful, playful in his own quarters. He possessed all the qualities that caused devotion in men. Among the dictations made after some readings is the one that follows. It was a first draft that the Emperor never saw again, and I show it here only as a sort of literary relaxation on this miserable rock. Thoughts on suicide. Does a man have the right to kill himself? Yes, if his death harms no one, and if life is an evil for him. When is life an evil for man? When it offers him only suffering and sorrow, but as suffering and sorrow change each moment, there's no time in life when a man has the right to kill himself. That time could arrive only at the very moment of his death, as only then would he have proof that his life was nothing but a web of evil and suffering. There's no man who has not wanted to kill himself several times in his life, yielding to the moral afflictions of his soul, but who a few days later would have regretted it because of changes in his feelings and circumstances. The man who would have killed himself on Monday will want to live on Saturday, and yet you can only kill yourself once. Man's life is made up of the past, the present, and the future. Or at least the present and the future. But if it is evil only in the present, he sacrifices the future. The ills of one day do not authorize him to sacrifice his life to come. Only the man whose life is bad and who can be certain, which is impossible, that it will always be so and will change in neither position nor will, either through changes in circumstance or situation or through habit and the passage of time, which still is impossible, would have the right to kill himself. The man who, succumbing to the weight of present evils, takes his life, commits an injustice towards himself, obeying, through despair and weakness, a momentary fantasy to which he sacrifices future existence. The comparison with a gangrened arm severed to save the body is not valid. When the surgeon amputates the arm, he is certain that it would kill the body. It is not a feeling, but a certainty. Whereas when one's life sufferings lead a man to kill himself, not only does he put an end to his sufferings, but he also destroys the future. A man may never regret having had an arm cut off, but if he could know it, he would almost always regret having taken his life. It was with such literary diversions that the Emperor passed the boredom of his long exile on the rock of St. Helena. The year 1819 had gone by, with alternating spells of good and bad health for the Emperor. He had gotten in the habit of strolling in one or the other of his small gardens, whose upkeep was the responsibility of Novaras. They were located under his window and surrounded by a small wooden fence, and either in his robe in the morning or dressed in the afternoon, he could enter them straight from his apartment. The duty officer found this advantageous to more easily verify the Emperor's presence at Longwood without his surveillance bothering the Emperor, and thus reassured the governor, whose mind was always fixated on attempted escape. That year he even granted larger boundaries to allow his majesty to exercise on horseback, but the Emperor only took advantage of this to reconnoiter the terrain in which he could ride with solely his staff. On January 1st, 1820, the Emperor received, as in the preceding years, the wishes of the Grand Marshal and his family, those of Count de Montsalon, the priests, and Dr. Antomarchi. They were all invited to dinner, including the children, who on such occasions he would always reward with a few gold Napoleons bearing his profile. The announcement of ships coming from Europe was always a moment of happiness for him because of the news he could receive from France. It was the same for the colony. Newspapers were read with great interest. One day, Count de Montsalon, on looking through them, said to the Emperor that they were about to demolish the fountain on the Place Royale to erect a statue of Louis XVIII. They only know how to do stupid things, replied the emperor. Why destroy an object of public utility to put such an insignificant king there? Another article reproached him for having had the weakness to surround himself with nobility. Marmont and Fouché were not nobles, he said. Talleyrand had not gone into exile. I entrusted my destiny to the former by sending him to Paris, and he went there only to consummate my ruin. A few days later, he commented, my actions and events answer all the libelous statements made against me. I am innocent of the ordinary crimes of dynasty heads. I have nothing to fear from posterity. History will perhaps even accuse me of having been too good. Montsalon, my son, he said to the general, grabbing him by the ear, I can present myself with confidence before God's judgment seat. The emperor's way of thinking was that one should die in the religion in which one had been born. That of one's forefathers. He said there was a destiny we all must obey. For some time, the emperor had spoken of enlarging the gardens under his windows. He felt the need to protect himself from the winds with an elevated grass berm. Not only did he see in this a means of distraction for himself and the colony, but he also found in it an advantage of further separating the house from the line of sentries placed there every evening at 9 p.m. Once the measurements had been taken and decided, everyone had to participate in the work. The emperor thus engaged in exercise beneficial to his health. It was also, he said to me, a means of facilitating Count de Montsalon's convalescence and of providing shade around a house that had none. He also believed that, in walking, he would find a way to escape the observation of the guard captain. Count de Montsalon did not guess what sentiment motivated the emperor. He agreed with His Majesty's idea only because he saw it as a means of improving his obviously declining health. The butler, Monsieur Pierron, was sent to town to buy wheelbarrows, pickaxes, shovels, and all the gardening tools suitable to clear and plant a fairly large area of land. Each had his own tools. The emperor himself had his rake and spade, which he used as a walking stick or to lean on when he watched the work. It began with the lawn berm on the southern side, which rose to 9 feet in height, with a base 9 feet wide and running 80 feet in length. Sir Hudson Lowe saw in that berm only what he was told, a shelter against the wind, and did not oppose it. But when he saw that the fence around the little gardens had been moved out that same distance, and that the night sentries were thus moved away from the house, he feared for the security of the detention. He mentioned this, but nevertheless did not dare take it upon himself to oppose what the emperor had just undertaken, and so the emperor gained that much more freedom around his house. The emperor and Count de Montsalon supervised the work. Every morning at daybreak, the colony was awakened by the duty valet. Often a stone thrown against my shutters by the emperor would announce that the time for work had arrived. Mine consisted mainly of tracing the layout under the direction of the emperor. If I took a spade, it was more to rectify than to dig, which led His Majesty to call me the Monitor. The emperor had adopted for dress a nankeen jacket, like a farmer's, and a pair of trousers of the same fabric, with red slippers and a wide-brimmed straw hat to protect him from the sun, with the shirt collar over that of the jacket, so as to be less recognizable. He had ordered Saint-Denis and Novarese to dress the same way. By his presence, the emperor spurred on each one to work. The doctor and the priests were also called on, as well as the Chinese. Everyone worked in proportion to his strength. Count Bertrand never arrived before 8 o'clock to chat while strolling with the emperor. Count de Montsalon was there at the same time as His Majesty. It sometimes happened that the emperor placed a shovel in their hands, but it was not used as it was in Novarese's hands. Gentlemen, he said, you are incapable of earning a shilling a day. The emperor himself wanted to use a pickaxe, but soon abandoned this as an instrument poorly suited to his hands. The planning of the gardens gave the emperor healthy exercise. This outdoor conversation for several hours did him good and made him tackle lunch with an appetite, a sensation we all generally felt at 10 o'clock. Then it got too hot, and everyone went inside. And the walls were built. He had a wooden fence enclosed all the part facing the camp, where he did not have to fear the wind, which he said parched him and made him irritable. It was to prevent animals from coming into the planted area he intended to make there. These gardens were considered interior gardens and moved the line of sentries posted at night to 80 feet from the house instead of 40 feet. When the work was started, the governor came to Longwood and offered everything we might desire, even soldiers, if this were judged necessary. Count de Montsalon thanked the captain of the guard who made this offer and said that the emperor was quite satisfied with what he had around him and needed no one. The Longwood personnel was increased by 4 Chinese for the care of the gardens and to continue the work during our absence in the course of the day. The emperor told me to give them each 30 shillings a month, and in addition to that, they received their government wages and food. Only the cook had been exempted from the morning work to attend to the preparation of the emperor's lunch. This was served at 10 o'clock in one of the small gardens, in the shade of his little orange grove, while waiting for our new plantings to provide shade in the larger gardens. Count de Monson was regularly present at this luncheon. Count Bertrand, if he remained until that time, was also invited. The priest and the doctor, in turn, were invited occasionally, but rarely. The luncheon was a soup, a vegetable, a meat dish. Then coffee, which he had poured over sugar. The meat dish consisted of chicken or a leg of mutton or a grilled rack of lamb. The emperor ate with appetite, and his health seemed to be satisfactory, although he continued to complain about his side. The emperor liked to extend the conversation at the table. It was generally the time he chose to tell stories of his youth, and it was a pleasure to listen to him because he spoke well, and without ever searching for his words, it seemed to flow naturally. Saint-Denis and Novarez served him. Some of these anecdotes were reported to me by them. He talked about Egypt and told how after arriving in Cairo, he had sent his son Eugene to present his regards to Murad Bey's wife, who remained locked up with the women in her harem. She was touched by the gracious manners of the young Frenchman and the general's politeness toward her. She had him served sherbet and gave him a very valuable ring. I sent her a message, the emperor said, that she was free to remain in Cairo or to go and join her husband. When Murad Bey was informed of my consideration to his wife, he sent me thanks. Another time, he related how, on his return from Syria, he wished to have news of Europe and sent one of his officers aboard the Turkish flagship to deal with the prisoners, fully thinking he would be stopped by Sidney Smith. That officer informed him of the loss of Italy. It was after reading the newspapers sent to him that he gave orders to Admiral Gontillon to prepare the frigate Miron. It was ordered to proceed to a given rendezvous where he got on board and returned to France after leaving instructions for Kléber. This return trip had been told so many diverse ways that I was charmed to hear it told so simply by the emperor himself. The emperor said one day, while glancing through the miracles of Jesus Christ, that Jesus should have done his miracles not in some isolated spot in Syria and only in front of a few men whose good faith could be suspect, but in a city like Rome, in view of the entire population. Leaving the table following lunch, the emperor returned to his bedroom, followed by Count de Montalon. If he dismissed him, he would get into bed and have me read to him until he fell asleep. Between 2 and 3 o'clock, he took his bath and conversed with one or the other of these gentlemen. If the doctor had been called, the emperor talked with him about medicine and about the anatomical work of Mescagna, whose plates he continued to trace in St. Helena. When the emperor got out of his bathtub, 2 very hot sheets were ready. One would be thrown over him, and he would wrap it around himself and go from the bathroom to his bedroom, where a bright fire was prepared. The second sheet was placed on his shoulders, and this way he was well dried. If the emperor was feeling well, he would dress immediately. He would put on silk stockings and buckled shoes and then don a pair of white cloth trousers and remain stripped from the waist up to do his beard. But in St. Helena, he shaved only every other day. All the details of his preparations were seen to with great care. His teeth had remained very fine and quite shiny, although he had not had any opiate for a long time and had to content himself with a little brandy mixed with water. After having run a brush over his head and combed his hair, he had his shoulders and body brushed, insisting that we press hard on the liver side while brushing briskly, as well as on the right shoulder, where he felt some pain. He then had cologne poured in his hand and would rub his side and chest with it, and put some under his arms after having washed his face in a large silver basin containing water mixed with cologne. For his hands and nails, he used a lemon. When all this washing was done, he completed his dress as I have already described in the chapter on the 100 Days, and he went into the drawing room. While on bivouac in his tent, these details of dress were carried out just as in the palace of Saint-Cloud or the Tuileries. If the emperor did not feel well, instead of dressing, he would get into bed to induce sweating, which always did him good. In St. Helena, the emperor wore only civilian clothes, carrying the badge of the Legion of Honor. His head was covered with the uniform hat so well known to all of Europe. His Majesty dressed in white every day. He liked to be very neat in his appearance, but took no precautions or care not to get dirty. He liked to feel at ease in his clothing and did not want anyone to change his shape. He hated having pimples in his mouth, and to avoid them, once he had finished dressing, he would apply a handkerchief soaked in cologne to his lips. All the emperor's linen was marked with N, capped by an imperial crown. Even on his silk stockings, a crown was placed over the embroidered corner of the stocking. One day, when Count Bertrand was present, while he was dressing the emperor while brushing his body, as I described above, asked him if he didn't do the same thing. "No, sire," replied the Grand Marshal. "You are mistaken, Bertrand. It prevents many diseases." "Sire, I have reached the age of nearly 50 without using it, and I am none the worse for it." "Well, rubbing my liver is good for me." "You don't believe it?" asked the emperor. And as the Grand Marshal was smiling while looking at him, "You don't believe that I'm ill. You are like your wife, who does not want to believe it either." "Sire, your majesty will allow me to say that he does not appear to be in bad health." "You dare to argue, Bertrand?" Taking the Grand Marshal by the throat and pinning him against the wall, he said, "Your money or your life, aristocrat!" he said, releasing him. "Your majesty will permit me to say that all his strength does not seem to have left him, for he was certainly holding me very tightly." "Without being tall, I never failed to be quite strong," said the emperor. "I remember when I was in military school, we minor nobles would have fights with the sons of great noblemen, and I always came out victorious." Knowing the very liberal ideas of the Grand Marshal, the emperor called him aristocrat. As long as the work on the gardens lasted, the emperor would come out at 4 p.m. and head for the Chinese workers. One day, one of them was digging close to a tall yew tree and cutting some large roots, which I believed would injure the tree. I pointed this out to the emperor, who replied, "If a fine table is served behind you, and you are hungry and allowed to sit down, you will certainly find a way to turn around to satisfy your appetite. It will be the same for this tree. It will take from its remaining roots on the other side the substance that has been withdrawn from it." A small pump had been purchased and mounted on wheels. It could be transported easily to all points of the garden. Saint-Denis or Novaras would work the pump lever, and the emperor amused himself by using the hose in those areas it seemed to him to be suffering from drought. In his gardens, he waited for dinner time while walking with Count Montlon. On leaving the table, weather permitting, he would get into his carriage and invite Count and Countess Bertrand to join him. But more often, he went alone with Count Montlon and had himself taken on his way back to see Countess Bertrand, who was often ill, and spent a few hours with her. The work at Longwood had caused quite a commotion in town. Among the visitors who came to see the gardens was Lady Lowe's daughter, a young and attractive person. She was curious not only to see the gardens, but also to catch a glimpse of the emperor, whom she did not know. Fate would have it that having entered the compound, she was met by Count de Montlon, to whom she expressed the desire that drew her to Longwood. The emperor's repugnance for the governor did not extend to his family. Count de Montlon promptly offered her his arm and took her around the various paths in the garden, but a providential coincidence served her even better. She found herself face to face with the emperor under a long bower covered with passion leaves where he was strolling. Her first reaction was that of great embarrassment, but it soon ceased before the gracious way in which the emperor received her. Sweets were served to her, and he offered her a rose as a memento of her pilgrimage. That young lady had been born of Lady Lowe's first marriage. Her mother was herself a very attractive woman, and would have asked nothing better than to be introduced at Longwood and have the honor of receiving the emperor in her home. But the unending harassment by her husband was always an obstacle to that wish.